There's projects planned in Australia that would more than double the amount of coal that we produce at the moment, and that would result in around 1.3 billion tonnes of additional emissions to the atmosphere. And there's plans to almost double our gas production as well, which would result in around 300 million tonnes.
So not phasing it out, but in fact doubling our production of gas and coal.
Putting our foot on the accelerator, throwing fuel on the fire. All those kind of metaphors spring to mind.
One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
How good is Australia?
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and today we're going to be talking about the latest news from COP26 in Glasgow, as well as diving into some research on the massive pipeline of gas and coal projects that Australia has.
Keep it in the ground, just keep it in the ground.
Go, 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 go. Fire alarm is going off. Smoke is filling our rooms and our lungs.
But it still won't be safe for communities like mine. 1.2 degrees is already hell for us.
There is no dignity to a slow and painful death. You might as well bomb our islands instead of making us suffer only to witness our slow and fateful demise.
Going to have large numbers of people in the world whose whole lives and countries are going to be destroyed. This is apocalypse. So we either take the steps now.
Forest pledges, on the methane pledges, on the coal phase out, on the combustion engine phase out, on all the technology innovations.
We are not going to turn off Australia's economy. And if they're buying, Hamish, well, we are selling.
So I'm delighted to introduce Polly Hemming and Mark Ogge from the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program. G'day, Mark and Polly. Thanks for joining me.
Hey, Eb.
Hi.
Polly, I'll start with you. Obviously, we've got Ben and Richard from the Institute are over in Glasgow, but it's a bit of an awkward time to be talking to them. But what is the latest coming out of the Glasgow COP at the moment? Most world leaders have left, and now the negotiations are kind of really starting down to get down to the nitty-gritty. Is that right?
That's right. So, yes, all the world leaders have left. The Santos diorama that was at the Australia Pavilion has been wheeled away and put in a cupboard somewhere. We've had in the last week, 3 big agreements were announced, 3 big pledges. There was one around deforestation and one around methane and one around coal.
So can we start with the deforestation? What was in that pledge?
Yeah, sure. So this is a deforestation agreement where more than 100 world leaders basically committed to halt and reverse deforestation by 2030. And this is one of the pledges that Australia actually did sign.
Oh, joy.
Oh, I know. Go us.
More than 100 countries had committed to ending and reversing deforestation.
We're ending the Great Chainsaw Massacre with more than 85% of the world's forests to be protected by the end of this decade.
It is very risky to say that cutting emissions by half by 2030 can now to 6 gigatons of the 20 gigatons that we need be provided by the forest pledge 2 days ago. It cannot.
Except if you look past or look a bit deeper, Australia basically signed it knowing that it was a very low risk thing to do and it wouldn't actually have to stop deforestation. So Australia is one of the world's hotspots for deforestation, and when questioned, Australia's Assistant Forestry Minister Jonathan Duniam, I think I've said that correctly, I'd never heard of him before now, he said signing the agreement wouldn't actually mean an end to deforestation, which is nice.
So super effective.
Yeah. Well, the way they look at deforestation is less about things like habitat destruction, and it's basically the emissions that come from deforestation. So deforestation emissions basically consist of 2 things. Carbon's released when you chop down a tree and carbon is stored when trees grow. And the reason we could sign this agreement but not actually have to do anything about stopping cutting down trees is because Australia's emissions from land clearing actually don't look too bad. So we clear a huge amount of land in Australia, but we still have about 134 million hectares of forest throughout the country. We could have more if we stop cutting down trees, but that's still quite a lot. And there's actually been a net increase in Australia's forest cover since 2008, but it's largely been by accident. Yeah, lucky us. We are the lucky country.
Yeah.
So first, there's been a substantial increase in regrowth everywhere since the end of the millennium drought.
Makes sense.
So it's rained a lot.
It rained.
Yeah. And that increased regrowth is not matched by an increase in the rates of reclearing. So we have a net increase in vegetation. And secondly, during the early 1990s, a lot of the deforestation was just clearing remnant vegetation, which is basically just clearing patches of native bush to use for agriculture or whatever. But deforestation now is actually dominated by reclearing rather than cutting down native trees, and remnant vegetation basically has a greater CO2 per hectare than reclearing. Sorry, I had a mental blank there. So while it seems really nice, don't think that Australia signed this agreement intending to actually do anything. You know, we've had some free kicks in the land sector thanks to nature, meaning that our emissions don't look as bad as they actually are in the accounts, but habitat is still being cleared. It was very low risk for us to sign this agreement.
Methane is one of the most dangerous greenhouse gases.
More than 100 countries have pledged to cut damaging methane emissions by 30%.
We're committing to collectively reduce our methane by 30% by 2030.
Australia would not be signing up to that. The Nationals here in Australia were particularly concerned what that might mean for Australia's agriculture sector. Worth noting that it would also have a big impact on the resources sector too.
And the only way you can get your 30% by 2030 reduction in methanes on 2020 levels would be to grab a rifle and go out and start shooting your cattle.
It would have been premature for Australia to sign up to that commitment.
While more than 40 nations have agreed to phase out the use of coal in electricity generation by the 2040s at the latest. Australia, though, has sided with China in refusing to sign either commitment.
To me, it was really significant how much this COP is focusing on fossil fuels. So take me through where things ended up with the methane pledge and anti-coal day.
Yeah, so the methane pledge was a US and EU-led pledge to slash methane emissions by 30% this decade. Australia didn't sign it, nominally because apparently we would have to kill all our cows if you're Barnaby Joyce. But then our emissions reduction minister got all-inclusive and said it would be wrong to discriminate against certain gases. So we didn't sign it for that reason. Mark can talk more to the real reason why we didn't sign it. We also didn't sign the coal phase out. So as you said, like this year's COP really demonstrates a clear shift away from avoidance to action, and fossil fuels have been targeted for the first time. So on Energy Day at COP, countries came together to make this really historic commitment to phase out coal. And it's the first time fossil fuels have been targeted in global negotiations. Over 190 countries and organisations made commitments to phase out coal power. And there were some really notable countries that signed up to this pledge, like Indonesia, South Korea, Poland, Vietnam and Chile, and they're big coal-producing countries. Australia didn't sign it. Again, I think Mark can probably tell us the reason why that was. And then, back at home, just yesterday, we had Keith Pitt on Radio National saying that if the world's going to keep buying, we're going to keep selling. So not only did we not sign, but we very, very clearly signalled that we're just forging ahead anyway.
That's some visionary leadership there, the kind we've come to know and love. Mark, moving away from COP for a moment and onto some of your research that is relevant to this conversation and to that Keith Pitt interview specifically. The rest of the world is moving away from fossil fuels, and it's quite explicit about that, including at COPs now. What is Australia doing, according to your research?
Australia, unfortunately, is absolutely doubling down on fossil fuels. The first thing to understand, really, is that emissions from fossil fuels that are produced in Australia are absolutely massive. We have our domestic emissions, which are probably around 200 million tonnes a year from fossil fuels, but a lot of those fossil fuels are burnt overseas as well. And all up, when you look at the total life cycle emissions from coal and gas produced in Australia, it results in about 1.5 billion tonnes of CO2 annually, which is equivalent to about 3 times our domestic emissions and probably the equivalent to about 200 coal power stations. So it's absolutely huge. So rather than winding that back, what we're actually doing is planning to build a whole lot more. So there's projects planned in Australia that would more than double the amount of coal that we produce at the moment over time, and that would result in around 1.3 billion tonnes of additional emissions to the atmosphere. And there's plans to almost double our gas production as well, which would result in around 300 million tonnes.
So not phasing it out, but in fact doubling our production of gas and coal.
Yep, putting our foot on the accelerator, throwing fuel on the fire. All those kind of metaphors spring to mind.
Yeah, and how many projects are we talking? Did you say it was more than 100 are in the pipeline?
Yeah, there's over 100 projects. I think there's 70-something coal projects and a bit over 40 gas projects, which are LNG and also for domestic production. But it's almost entirely for export. Pretty much all the coal projects are for coal to be exported, and almost all of the gas projects for export as well. And you've got to remember that Australia is already the largest exporter of coal in the world and the largest exporter of LNG. So what we're talking about is ramping that up further. And this is, just after the International Energy Agency has said that there should be no more coal and gas developments globally, period. And the UN Secretary General has said that we've got to stop burning fossil fuels, or, it'll be a death knell to the planet, despite that Australia's just kind of doubling down on this kind of crazy path of fossil fuel production.
We've got to stop burning coal and gas. We've got to reduce methane emissions. This is a crisis.
We are not going to turn off Australia's economy. Australia produces just 4% of the world's thermal coal. It's some of the world's highest quality, and that's why we'll continue to have markets for decades into the future. And if they're buying, Hamish, well, we are selling.
Our focus is whole of economy, all gases. That's our goal. We've got a net zero goal for 2050 for the whole economy.
When we talk about Australian new projects in Australia adding up to 1.7 billion tonnes a year potentially, what we're talking about is projects that are planned in Australia. So they may not all go ahead, but they could go ahead, and the government is aggressively pursuing policies to make sure as many as possible go ahead. And there's also projects that haven't been proposed yet that could go ahead. Now, they're not all going to go ahead at the same time, but over time, these are all really serious, very big coal and gas projects that the government is trying to push through.
Yeah.
And if all of them went ahead, it would result in around 1.7 billion tonnes of life cycle emissions per year, which is even more than the entire life cycle emissions of coal and gas burnt in Australia at the moment. Those emissions, of course, would occur in Australia and overseas when the coal and gas is burnt, but they're all emissions resulting from coal and gas that we're allowing to be produced in Australia.
So it's if all of those projects go ahead, but we selected them because they're the ones that they have a decent possibility of going ahead, say, in the next 5 years.
And they include all the projects that the government publishes under its Resources and Energy Major Projects list. So it's an official list of projects that are under development in Australia. But we also included gas developments from the Beetaloo Basin, because the government has an express policy called the gas-fired recovery of opening up the Beetaloo Basin. And we also included a small scenario from the Canning Basin in Western Australia, because the Western Australian government has just allowed exports of gas from the Canning Basin. So we just looked at the projects that are planned and have a good chance of going ahead over the next few years.
It's pretty alarming, Polly. I mean, what's the world's reaction been to Australia's role at Glasgow?
I think we've been a bit of a joke. Even in our long-term low emission strategy, that the plan flip that that Morrison's waving around, there's a line in it that explicitly says Australia's coal and gas export industries will continue through to 2050 and beyond. And this is the plan that we took to COP. I think we're very much it's a diplomatic event, so everyone's being very polite, but we've already been called out by the UK on our intention to keep digging up coal and exporting it. And I think there's plans to hold Australia to account in a more broad sense.
Yeah, can you tell me about that? Are you alluding to the ratchet mechanism that's been floated there or something else?
Yeah, I'm alluding to the ratchet mechanism. So basically, for those in the public service, Australia is going to be performance managed. Really? So there is a lot of pressure on Australia to lift its 2030 emissions target, and that pressure is only expected to escalate and continue into next year. Apparently there was a document released by British hosts at Glasgow recently, and there's a really big push for countries that haven't improved on their short-term targets to be told that they have to come up with something better next year. So our NDC, just to remind you, that 26 to 28% is what Tony Abbott came up with in 2015. And we've done nothing since then. All we did was commit to net zero ahead of COP. We're coming with nothing else except a plan to back in fossil fuels and a really weak target. While it hasn't been confirmed, there's the expectation that Australia and a couple of other countries, I think Brazil and Saudi Arabia were also singled out, that we have to increase our ambition sooner rather than later.
And Mark, as you've said, our ambition is to double our gas and coal exports and keep expanding fossil fuels out beyond 2050. And part of the way that the government is planning to square that circle is carbon capture and storage. Now, I'm not that old, but I've been in federal politics for long enough to know that carbon capture and storage has been about 5 years away for 20 years now.
Well, we've seen significant advances in carbon capture and storage, for example. We know we've got one of the largest offshore in northwest of Australia. We know that we've got significant advancements in that technology, and there's trials in places like Millmerran.
Now, this is a scam and a con. CCS is a proven failure. It's just too complex and too
Walk
expensive.
me through Australia's plans around carbon capture and storage. I mean, has there been any technological breakthrough? Is there any reason to hope that the government, pinning all its hopes on CCS, will actually sequester any carbon, make it commercial, anything like that? Where are things at with carbon capture and storage?
Carbon capture and storage is an absolute fraud. And the best example I can give is with capturing emissions from coal power stations. So for the last 20 years, the focus of CCS, carbon capture and storage, has been on capturing emissions from coal power stations.
Yeah, it was just going to get bolted on to existing coal-fired power stations. That was how it used to be sold. I remember Greg Hunt explicitly talking about we're just going to retrofit our existing coal-fired power fleet of power stations, and then we're just going to pipe it away and bury it underground. How's that going?
Yeah. So not very well. So despite 20 years and billions of dollars in Australia and globally, there's not a single light bulb in Australia that's powered by a coal power station with CCS. And globally, a grand total of 1 million tonnes is theoretically sequestered. That's from a power station called Boundary Dam in Canada. And that 1 million tonnes of CO2 is then sold to an oil and gas company and pumped underground in a kind of a tertiary extraction process to get more oil out of a depleted oil field, which in the end almost certainly creates more emissions than are sequestered.
I mean, what a scam.
Complete 110% failure in terms of sequestering emissions from coal power stations. And then, but more recently, the oil and gas industry has recognised its potential as a public relations campaign and a way to sort of a narrative to justify their continued expansion. And so what they've done is they've rebranded a 50-year-old oil and gas industry practice called enhanced oil recovery, which they pump carbon dioxide underground to get oil and gas out of depleted fields. And this was never this was never had anything to do with emissions abatement. In fact, it was about, producing more fossil fuels, and it was invented in the 1970s in America, and it's been done ever since. But the industry came up with the argument that some of the CO2 they were pumping underground would stay underground, and they've tried to count that as abatement and rebrand enhanced oil recovery as carbon capture and storage, or carbon capture utilisation and storage, where the utilisation is for enhanced oil recovery. And 3/4 of the projects in the world, 22 out of the 28 projects that actually exist and are operating in the world, are actually rebranded enhanced oil recovery projects. And there's 6 projects that are dedicated geological storage, which add up to less than 10 million tonnes of abatement a year, which is minuscule. And that's the maximum capacity of abatement. And the largest of those projects is the Chevron Gorgon project in Western Australia. And that's been a dismal failure. It's only sequestered about 30% of the emissions it promised to sequester. So the 10 million tonnes is likely to be overstated as well. So this isn't a technology, it's a public relations campaign. If the objective was to sequester emissions, it's been a complete and utter failure. But actually, the objective is to create a narrative to allow the oil and gas industry to continue to expand. And in that sense, it's been a huge success.
Massive success, I'd say. I mean, that's so depressing.
Can I add something even more depressing?
Oh, please do. Let's double down while we're in here.
I've mentioned this before, but I just can't let it go because it's absolutely bonkers. So this CCS in Australia is now going to be able to generate carbon credits that other companies can use to offset their own emissions. So Mark has written quite a lot about this. But so the Moomba CCS project, that was the diorama that was at the Australia Pavilion.
Oh, yeah, famously.
That was demonstrating how Santos would not only store 1.7 million tonnes of CO2, which is just a fraction of the emissions from that whole project, by the way, of CO2 underground, but they would also be generating carbon credits that they can use to sell to other high-emitting, I'm doing like inverted commas, other high-emitting industries that need to offset their emissions. Like, it is the worst of both worlds, offsetting fossil fuels with offsets from fossil fuels. It's so crazy. I don't even have words.
It's almost hard to explain. Yeah, it's not believable.
I could talk about it all day, or just make kind of noises like that. A disbelief all day. It's psychotic.
Are you going to make it worse, Mark? What else have we done?
Just another way to think about CCS is actually like the classic kind of magician's thing is the distraction strategy. It's like, look over here so you're not looking over there at what I'm really doing. And CCS is exactly that, because they say, look over here at these emissions that we're sequestering, so that we don't look at the massive amount of emissions that they're actually creating. And the classic example is the Gorgon project in Western Australia that I mentioned before. So even if that worked, which it doesn't, it'd sequester around 4 million tonnes a year. But that project was a prerequisite for approval for the Chevron's massive Gorgon LNG project, which has life cycle emissions of about 56 million tonnes a year, right? So even if it was working, it would only sequester around 7% of those emissions. So they get us to focus on this theoretical capture of a small fraction of the emissions, so that we don't look at the big picture, which is the massive amount of emissions from the LNG project. And that is the strategy that is at the very foundation of CCS, which is at its base a marketing campaign.
This reminds me, my nan during lockdown frequently called just to check how I was doing because I live alone. This reminds me of me telling Nan that, yes, I eat my vegetables and I had some zucchini with dinner last night, and perhaps not telling her about the 3 boxes of choc chip biscuits that I ate. At the same time. That's right. Look at the zucchini, Nan. I'm healthy.
Yeah.
That's Australia's whole approach, isn't it? Like that Barnaby Joyce pointing to cows and saying, we can't get rid of methane, you animal killers. Like, why do you hate animals?
And the world is
Australia?
talking about our LNG exports.
Exactly.
To go back to COP, Polly, it's obviously got a little way to go. What is kind of left on the agenda as we head towards the end of Glasgow?
Well, today actually is Adaptation Day. So under the Paris Agreement, each nation is meant to have a national adaptation plan. And that's all about ensuring that countries have resilience or enhance their resilience in the face of climate change. What do you reckon Australia's adaptation communication is like?
I'm going to say top-notch, A+, gold standard.
Correct. We are just throwing money at making sure Australia is resilient. We've got nothing. So we recently released our National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy. It's a strategy, it's not a plan. At least 106 other countries have policies and plans for adaptation. We don't have anything. We've never done a national risk assessment when it comes to climate change. We stripped emissions reductions from the National Climate Resilience and Adaptation Strategy.
Of course we did.
Yeah, because environment and I don't even, I just can't even, like, if you're going to go ahead with climate, like, just enhance the climate crisis, at least do something to clean up the mess afterwards. But no,
we're not even doing that.
Nah, it's already going to cost us $38 billion annually, and it's now projected in this new strategy to get up to $73 billion annually by 2060.
And I guess if people want an example of what this looks like on the ground, might we point to, for example, the fact that The Guardian today was reporting that of all the people that lost their houses in the Black Summer bushfires, just a tiny fraction of them are even rebuilding or in the middle of rebuilding, and few of them have actually rebuilt at all. Most of them are still living in caravans. Would that be a useful thing to point to, Polly, in terms of how we're dealing with this?
Yeah, I think that is probably quite a useful case study, and that's going to happen again. We can expect events like the Black Summer bushfires to happen again in Australia. It's only going to become more frequent, and not forgetting the floods that then came, less than 12 months later. So that's happening today. Next, we're going to have Transport Day. Yay, which is about accelerating the transition to zero emissions vehicles. And
I'm almost scared to ask. But did the Prime Minister, it struck me today that he had some type of transport announcement around electric vehicles, but I didn't detect really many details in that either. Was there any policies in that?
We don't even have an electric vehicle strategy. We've got something called a future fuel strategy, also known as FFS. It's just as...
You're going to make me get into hysterics now, Polly.
You know where we launched it? We launched it out the front of, I think it was a Toyota factory, and they don't even have any electric vehicles. Like, they've got hydrogen fuel cells. So that shows you where we're at.
Today we are launching our future fuels and vehicles strategy.
Pumping $250 million into a plan to encourage take-up of green vehicles and drive down emissions.
We don't want to drive those costs down by writing off big cheques to multinational companies. That's not the way you do this.
This was a bit unfortunate, given the press conference was held at the Toyota Hydrogen Centre, which has received $3 million in government funding.
It addresses about 5% of what's needed.
This policy doesn't include consumer subsidies, tax incentives or minimum standards for fuel emissions.
We need to make sure that we don't continue to fall behind. Australia last year had under 2% of new vehicle sales were electric vehicles.
We launched the second instalment of the Future Fuel Strategy. We're projecting lower EV uptake and lower CO2 abatement under the FFS than was what was initially projected under the Climate Solutions Package EV strategy, which the government proposed in 2019, while it was also publicly attacking EVs.
It's not going to tow your trailer. It's not going to tow your boat. It's not going to get you out to your favourite camping spot with your family. Bill Shorten wants to end the weekend when it comes to his policy on electric vehicles.
The important take-home message is we're doing less than we promised a couple of years ago.
Exactly.
Great.
Yeah. We don't have an electric vehicle strategy. We've got this kind of very vague, ambiguous future fuel strategy. So That's coming up, Eb.
This is what always happens with anytime I talk to the climate and energy team. I feel like I have to promise our listeners that we're going to do something on like sunshine and rainbows and curing cancer, or, you know, like, because it's so, I mean, it's disgusting is what it is. It's offensive.
Yeah.
And it's like we're all giggling here, and it's not appropriate, but it's the only response, because otherwise
we all go home and cry.
Yeah,
we're laughing
it's
here.
terrible.
Everyone, but it's really grim. The other thing that's coming up is Article 6. Do you remember when Australia was going to carry over its achievement,
yes,
again, in inverted commas?
Kyoto carryover.
Yeah. So there's that. You know, we said we weren't going to use our carryover credits, but we didn't sign anything, so that we need to see what happens with those negotiations. And that
are you telling
also
me, Polly, that it's still a possibility that we might use our Kyoto credits?
Well, he didn't. Basically, what Morrison said kind of amounted more. Basically, he kind of just said, "Oh, we don't reckon we're going to have to use them." He never said, "I swear." But what else we discuss in Article 6 is carbon markets. And Australia is busting to tap into an international offset trading scheme. And we did a podcast about the fact that at least 20% of Australia's carbon credits are hot air. So it's going to be a real problem if we start exporting our carbon credits internationally, and also if we enable Australian gas companies, which is part of our net zero plan, if we make it easier for our gas companies to offset their emissions, because that kind of gives them something to hide behind on their sustainability plans and their own glossy brochures. So that's kind of fraught too, and that's coming up, but we'll have more information about what happens there.
A survey of climate scientists suggests that many are not confident that global emissions can be cut quickly enough to avoid a climate catastrophe.
To really work on the forest pledges, on the methane pledges, on the coal phase out, on the combustion engine phase out, on all the technology innovations, all the S-curves, all the equity dimensions. But now we are in an emergency point. We've reached the final decisive decade of our opportunity to land safely at 1.5, and 1.5 is a real planetary boundary.
I feel like we should just, as a favour to the listeners, wrap things up there before we can make things any worse. I mean,
has anyone got any good news to share?
The Indian government coming with, with a really huge renewable energy target is fantastic, and it shows up, the absolute ridiculousness of Australia's position. So every Indian uses a tiny fraction of the carbon, or produces a tiny fraction of the carbon of Australians, and yet they've come to the table with a huge commitment to rolling out renewable energy at a massive scale, which Australia should be doing, and that's great news, and that's getting us staying under 1.5, it's bringing us, we're nowhere near it, but it's bringing us a lot closer than we were before.
I appreciate that, Mark.
It's also really great that we're finally confronting fossil fuels. That is a major breakthrough.
Yeah.
And other countries committing to phase out coal. That's
to wrap up, major emitters like India are coming to the party, which is such good news globally. There's a massive focus on fossil fuels. That's also really amazing news and hasn't happened at any previous COPs. And the bad news is that Australia is even worse than possibly we thought they were going to be. Is that a good summary, I guess, of where we've ended up?
Yeah, that's a good summary. But even then, like Australia, we might be taken to task. Like it might be made so hard for us to not do something.
Yeah.
There's always that.
And I guess just to leave people with a little bit of hope, the state governments seem to be taking up the mantle of leadership when it comes to actual climate action. And we've seen some real ambition at the state government level, the subnational level. So that's always exciting. I have heard, and we have spoken to on our webinar series, Saul Griffith, who talks about rewiring Australia and how we can move all of Australians domestically, their domestic heating and cooking and everything else. We're going to electrify homes with technology that's available right now, and it will not only reduce emissions but save us a bucket of money. So those are all the positive things I could think of to finish up, so we don't all go home and cry into our pillows.
I actually think it's amazing that we not only have all the solutions to climate change, but they're actually cheaper than what we're doing now in terms of energy. I mean, that is an extraordinary achievement of all of those engineers and people out there who are actually out in the energy system developing renewable energy, electrification, energy
Batteries.
efficiency, buildings, all of that kind of stuff. It's extraordinary, and it's a huge amount of hope that we can have. And if we did it, we'd actually save money. It's just the fossil fuel industry are hanging on like crazy, and they lobby and threaten governments like the Australian governments, and we just need to make sure our elected representatives stand up to them, and rather than representing those companies, represent our interests instead of theirs.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. Apologies if we got a bit hysterical in the middle there, but it really is, when you lay it all out like that, it's ridiculous. So that's all that was. We do take these things seriously, and it is alarming. Thank you very much, Polly Hemming and Mark Ogge. This episode was recorded on Tuesday, the 9th of November, 2021, and things may have changed since recording. You can visit australiainstitute.org.au for all our latest research, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is Ebony_Bennett with a _N_T. You can find Mark at Mark Ogge, that's OGGE, and Polly is at Polly J. Hemming. And our producer, Jennifer Macy, is at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music from Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, get vaccinated as soon as you can, and thanks for listening.